I'm going to add now a knockout layer to this group. So here's the idea. I'm very happy with my stopwatch layer, and I'm just absolutely in love with my earth layers, and same with that lens flare at the very back of the stack. However, I want to see through to the pupil. Right now, the way I've got everything layered in front of the eye, it just doesn't look like an eye anymore. And I figure if I just cover up the iris, I should be fine. I need to see through to the pupil at the center of the image. And to accomplish that pupil reveal inside this image, I'm going to create what's called a knockout, an independent layer that cuts holes in everything below it. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the eyeball for the knockout group so I can see through to the iris below. And I'm going to click on watch here. Notice that doesn't turn on the layer, just makes it active. And I'm going to create a new layer inside the stack. I'm going to go ahead and do it though from the keyboard by pressing Command Option N or Control Alt N on the PC. And I'm going to call this new layer Pupil. And then I'm just going to click OK. No clipping mask necessary, nothing else. Don't need to select anything else here. And I'll click OK in order to accept this new layer. Now, currently it's an empty layer. I'm going to get, once again, my elliptical marquee, which is currently selected for me, and I'm going to drag around my pupil, a little outside the pupil as well. Notice that I'm including, well, I'd say something around 1/4 inch on all sides outside the pupil here. And then I'm going to feather this selection by pressing, once again, Command-Option-D, now that I can, or Control-Alt-D on the PC to bring up the feather selection dialog box. And I'm going to reduce this value to something like 8 pixels this time around, and click OK. And now I'm going to fill this selection with any old color, doesn't matter. And just to make my point, I'm going to go get my color palette here, and I'm going to dial in a ridiculously bright red. Just any color will do. We could have used black, but black would match the pupil, and you wouldn't get the sense of what's really going on here. So I'm going to fill it with red by cranking up that R value inside the color palette, and by pressing Option-Delete or Alt-Backspace on the PC. And two things here. If you don't see RGB inside the color palette, you can switch to the RGB sliders by choosing the RGB sliders command from the palette menu. The other thing that might sort of throw you, you might be even more curious about this, why you just got done filling this selection with red and yet you're not seeing what the heck's going on inside this layer. And the reason is because the layer's inside the knockout group and the knockout group is invisible. Go ahead and turn on the knockout group and you will indeed see your red. All right, because you want to see red, right? In this case, you do. All right, I'm going to press Command-D or Control-D on the PC to deselect that selection. And now we're going to change it to a knockout. Here's how. I'm going to double-click on the pupil layer. And the best place to double-click is on the thumbnail. So double-click on the thumbnail, not on the name, or you'll change the name. Double-click on the thumbnail to bring up the enormous layer style dialog box. And now I'm going to change the knockout from none to shallow. Okay, so this knockout option turns the active layer into a hole cutting device. And we'll discuss the difference between shallow and deep in just a moment. But for now, I'm just going to select shallow. And I'll show you what the layer looks like. It looks no different. It's not cutting a hole in anything right now. Why is that? And the reason is because this knockout option works with the fill opacity. The fill opacity is currently cranked up to 100%. Watch what happens as I reduce that fill opacity value. I'll bring this dialog box over just a little bit so we can see what's going on. Right now, the fill opacity, take my word for it, is set to 38%. You can still see some of the red, and you can also see through to the pupil. And the lower the fill opacity value gets, the more of a hole it cuts. So go ahead and crank the fill opacity all the way down to 0, and you will cut a hole all the way through to the very bottom of this layer stack. Okay, so this is what we have the option set to. Knockout to shallow, fill opacity to 0%, okay. And notice what's happened here. So I'll go ahead and turn off the pupil layer so we can see how it is really a hole. And then I'll turn it back on. So the fact that it's red or any other color doesn't matter at all. All that we care about is that it's a nice hole into the background imagery and it cuts a hole into the pupil of this eye. And now, in my opinion, all the trimmings around the iris read a lot better and don't obscure the fact that this is an eyeball inside somebody's head. So that's one example of truly advanced blending inside of Photoshop CS2, knockouts.